All right, we've got friends pouring in. Welcome everybody to this webinar hosted by Law Insider with our friends from SpotDraft. As you come in, we're going to start on time, but as you come in, if you'll do what we always do, I'm going to ask our normal question. Where are you coming from? Where in the world are you? We have a very global audience, so it's always cool to see where people are. If you look at the bottom, you have a chat feature. Just go into the chat feature and let us know where you are coming from. All right. Hey, everybody, I'm Mike Whalen. I am the Chief Community Officer at Law Insider. We are happy today to host our friends from SpotDraft to talk about starting and switching CLM. If you've ever dealt with this, honestly, it's the implementation that's the thing. We tend to widge and wodge about our choices of which CLM to use, but, I can't tell you how many times people get it, and then it'll sit on the pile somewhere. It's like all my gardening tasks that all my tools are just found outside somewhere. So we're going to talk about that today. Before we do, I just want to talk about a couple of logistics things real quick to answer the obvious and common questions. There are no slides, so you will not get slides. There is no CLE credit for this. We can have a long conversation about what it is to offer CLE to a global company, but short version, it's a pain. You will get the recording of this episode of this webinar afterwards if you want to review that later. So certainly take notes, but mostly I would like you to engage, and I'll tell you all how to do that. You have two features on Zoom that we're able to use, the chat feature and the Q&A feature. Both are at the bottom. The chat is for the purpose of talking to each other mostly. We all have horror stories to tell about this, so please go over to the chat and tell us what you broke. This is a safe space. We know you broke it. So just go over and share it in the chat, your experiences, talk with each other. The Q&A feature is to talk to Akshay and the other guests to ask questions. We will try to have a little bit of time at the end of this conversation for Q&A. If we do not, it's okay. Go ask the questions anyway, because we can use it to understand what else you want to learn about in the future. So please use the Q&A feature and the chat feature as well. Okay, final reminder, if you will go into the chat and let us know where you are coming from. We want to see that the chat is working, that you are mentally and physically present. With that, I'm going to turn time over to Akshay Verma. Akshay is the COO of SpotDraft. He's got experience in legal functions at Meta and Coinbase. He's now an adjunct professor at Santa Clara University, I think so. Is that right, Akshay?
That is.
All right.
Indeed.
I'm going to turn time over to Akshay, who will introduce the rest of our guests, and we'll come back at the end to handle some questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mike. Great to have everyone. Let's get our first poll question up. And as we're doing quick introductions with the panelists, hopefully we'll get some responses. I think it'll help us direct some of the conversation as well as consider potential future topics for discussion for additional webinars. So Mike did a fantastic introduction of me. You don't need to hear any more about me. You'll hear me talk plenty through the course of the next hour. I'm going to turn it over to Susan to do a quick introduction of herself, and then Navin will go over to you.
Thanks, Akshay. I'm Susan Koenig. I'm the Senior Legal Operations Manager at Abnormal Security. I've been in the legal field for almost 20 years, specifically in legal ops for almost 10. That's pretty much about me.
Thanks, Susan.
That was awesome, Susan. Thank you. Thanks, Akshay. Hi, everyone. My name is Navin Mahavijan. I'm managing partner at Black Paladin Solutions. I have the fortune or misfortune of having been an attorney myself. I got my start in oil and gas, so lots of contracts before CLM was a thing. And I've spent over 1.5 decades in the legal ops field as well, working in systems, implementing them, using them. And so, it's been a lot of fun. And hopefully we'll get to talk a little bit about it today.
Thanks to you both. Just a quick reminder on the polls. We'll take a look at some of the responses there to see where we landed. Look, our goal today is to hopefully give the audience both some conceptual advice around how to think about buying a CLM or switching a CLM. But I think more importantly, which is definitely what I was after in my roles as the head of legal ops at Facebook and at Coinbase, which was, okay, what are the tactics? Like, what are some specific things that I should be thinking about? What are some specific things on this journey that I should be doing? What are potentially some pitfalls to avoid? And so as we thought through who should actually be engaging this conversation, obviously with the wealth of information that Navin's had in his career, and Susan is literally in the middle of this right now. So I think there's a lot that she can also offer to the conversation. So we hope that it unfolds in exactly that fashion. But before we kind of get into the nitty-gritty of kind of, you know, switching something out or implementing something from a CLM perspective, let's have a very foundational question. Navin, I want to start with you on this, and would love to hear your perspective on when does an organization even know that it's ready for a CLM tool? Now, I think we can all agree that not every single company needs a CLM tool, but at some point you get to a juncture in your journey where like, okay, we're ready for a CLM tool. What are some things, what are some conditions that should be present for that? That's number one. And then Susan, I'd love for you to follow up as a corollary to that, which is, okay, I've had a CLM tool in place for a while. How do I know that I'm ready to switch? Right. So let's start with Navin. We'll start with you, and then we'll head over to Susan.
Oh, definitely. I mean, there are a couple of markers that you can look for as an organization, right? And all kidding aside, they usually take the form of complaints as well. But I think volume is a big piece of this. You know, from a CLM perspective, we're looking at dealing with contracts. And so as your business is scaling, if you have a couple of hundred to 1,000 contracts annually, that's a good indicator that you might need to systematize and run them through a platform. The other piece is efficiency as well. And this is a bit more nuanced because what is efficient isn't always going to be the same for everyone. But if you have your business side or your core users or clients, stakeholders as a legal team that are complaining that things are taking too long, or if you're observing inconsistencies in how your contracts are handled, that's another marker as well. If you spend a lot of time trying to track down contracts that have been signed with your vendors, with your customers, that is another marker that you can look for as well and identify as a reason. All of this ultimately leads into something that I think, you know, we'll probably touch on later, but your purpose in getting a CLM system. These tools are designed to solve a problem. So it's these problems that you need to identify and, you know, kind of address with the platform. So number of contracts, complaints, you know, what's taking too long or what's inconsistent as well. You can also identify lost deals. If you are seeing a large number of contracts that are not signed, we just hit the end of, you know, Q3 as well. If your sales team is not closing contracts and you're seeing a lot of contracts getting signed and approved and closed at the beginning of October, that is another marker as well. So timeliness of how quickly contracts are getting signed as well. And those are kind of very kind of high level comments, right, Akshay? But I think what you need to do to identify if you really have these issues is to do a deep dive with your stakeholders to understand what's real and what is just someone having a bad day and complaining that their contract took too long to sign.
Well, I think for our audience who's predominantly in legal, whether they're lawyers or legal ops professionals, that word complaints is far too familiar. You can over-index on that. I think that's a really good point to call out. That's a good one. All right. So Susan, I have had a CLM for a couple of years. It's been going along. What are some of the things that I should look for when I'm like, yeah, you know, it's time to switch out? And what are the conditions that should be present there?
Yeah, so I would say what I considered when deciding to switch was user adoption. Like how many users were having trouble with the existing platform, right? You've had it for a number of years generally, or even a year, right? It shouldn't be something that's hindering your process. So that's one thing. Features is another big thing. How is this going to enhance your process? How is this going to speed things up? How is this going to make it easier, right? Like when I was considering platforms, you have to really recognize that they're actually two end users, right? You have legal on one side that's sitting there and negotiating, and they have a certain set of requirements. And then you have the business users on the other side who are interacting with the other end of the platform, and they have different requirements. And how can you satisfy everybody's needs in a way that's going to keep business moving as quickly as possible without hiccups? Stability, right? You want to think about how the platform's built, how well it's working, and then making sure that it's, like I said, on both sides of the fence, that it's going to help both people, like both end users, solve their problems.
Susan, one of the first things you mentioned was around adoption internally. Legal technology, as cost effective as it can be, is still an expense for any organization. And to buy something and not have adoption can be a pretty significant drag in a variety of different ways. Is there any advice that you would offer up on that element, on an existing piece of technology that anyone may have? Like, do you just cut bait? Do you get underneath it with some data? Like, what are there conversations that are needed to be had to understand, like, why are we just not adopting this tool?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you'll see, right? Like you can see in the platforms who's using it and who isn't, right? Who's coming to attorneys to be like, I can't do this, I can't do that. Like, what's going on, right? This is all happening in real time, and attorneys are reporting this. Like, if you have a legal ops function, like that's generally information that's being passed back to us, right? So we're tracking that too. You can pull data, right? You can look at like workflows specifically and see like the length and how, like who's using it, right? Like there have been some cases where an AE just doesn't use it, and it's their manager who's kind of taking over that role of interacting with the platform because either they're having trouble or they're not. We track that through just questions. Right now, just coming in, like we have a channel to help us track those kind of requests, right? So we can see when people are having issues. And then around getting adoption, right? Like, so you've invested in this tool. What do you do, right? If there is no, like if you're having trouble with adoption, it's time consuming, but enablement is key, especially around when you're implementing. And I'm sure we'll talk about this, later on in the session. But enablement is important. There's a variety of different ways that you can go about doing it. I think it's kind of specific to each company in terms of the medium in which you do it. Like, is it help documentation? Is it just short videos that people can quickly grab from a site and watch on how to use the platform? But there are various ways that you can enable the team so that it helps get them on board and then excited and recognize that this isn't something that's here to make their life more difficult. It's actually here to make everybody's life easier.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, in fact, we'll kind of switch in just a minute here to internal stakeholder alignment, not just if you're selecting for the first time, but if you're switching out. But the reason I asked that follow-up question is, if your analysis on lack of adoption or any other problems with an existing system are limited or are surface level, then the chances of you falling back into that situation with any new tool are significantly higher. So I think getting underneath the why around a lack of adoption, or functionality or whatever it might be is so important, because that then allows you to reevaluate the process internally and or evaluate a new tool moving forward. Navin, you've done this a lot, both in terms of your own internal roles in legal operations, but also as a former seller of a tool and now as a consultant and an implementation. Where do you see the biggest pitfalls with respect to adoption?
Oh my goodness. So adoption issues are rarely related to the platform itself. And what I would say is there are some platforms that are difficult to use and obtuse, and hopefully you will weed those out in selection as well. But really, adoption challenges boil down to sometimes bad design. We've launched our system, but we didn't structure a workflow or the way we intake contracts in a user-friendly way. We just kind of got a list. And so the implementation itself does play a huge factor. What you roll out might just not be user-friendly to your organization, especially if you just copied and pasted your manual processes into a system, things that people already found troublesome instead of refining it. So that's one element I think that leads to poor adoption because people just don't want to use it. And the other piece, and Susan touched on it already, I think stakeholder engagement and involving stakeholders early on in the implementation is critical. If they're not bought in, they're not going to push their own separate teams to kind of get into the system and use it. There is something to be said for enforcement and accountability as well. Those of you on legal teams here, you know this, no matter what process you have, there will always be that one guy that will still email the attorney a draft and say, hey, can you look at this, my special particular matter? So there's an element of enforcement and accountability, whether if you look at it just from a contract policy, contracts must be reviewed by legal. There will be people that will try to bypass that. You can tackle that in a variety of ways. One I've seen with sales teams is you tie it to compensation. A lot of organizations did this with Salesforce adoption. If you don't document everything in Salesforce, you don't get paid. I love that. And every organization that I was with that did that had surprisingly exceptional adoption of Salesforce. And then training as well. And training is a bit more nuanced because it's education. So I think having an assortment of training materials, video recordings, documentation, but also live training and office hours, that is something that not many people do that I found was immensely successful. Just a lot of time so that your business users can come in with questions and ask for issues and create chat channels in Slack or in Teams that people can jump into to ask questions on the fly and actually respond to those questions, especially in the first couple of months of launching a system, because that's when you have the greatest amount of friction when it comes to adoption.
Yeah, and also the greatest chance of success if it's done properly. I think that's a really, really good call out. Yeah, like there's an adage, certainly in legal tech, but in technology in general, certainly in legal operations, which is process before technology. And maybe it's a little bit ironic that somebody who sells a CLM tool into the market would actually advocate for that, but it's a very self-serving adage because where I've seen clients and customers have their processes tightened up, maybe not perfect, or revised before implementation, the implementation and adoption is therefore far greater. So I will always advocate for, in fact, I just got off a call earlier this morning where we had to tell a prospect, like, we're seeing a lot of gaps in your existing process. So we'd really like to help fix those before we get into the implementation side with our tool. I think that goes a long way for success. Susan, can you talk, and we want to touch on internal stakeholder before we move on to kind of what the market is and what we should be thinking about and looking at with respect to the CLM tool market. But any advice or war stories that you're willing to share around internal stakeholder? Like what was successful for you? What worked? What is maybe one thing you wish you would have had done differently?
So internal stakeholders, change is hard, right? So that's the first thing, right? When you bring to them that you're either thinking of implementing a tool or changing a tool, right? You have to get it will not work if everyone's not on board, right? It's important to make your case to show what the value it's going to bring, right? If you can, especially if you can illustrate already that there's process breakdown, right? Things are getting lost, in email or however you're doing it. For us, when we switched, it was important for me to get all stakeholder feedback. It was like, what do you like? What do you don't like? What would you like to see? So when you go out into the market, you have a foundation on what you're trying to build, right? Like especially when you're looking at a new tool, not even just to replace one, knowing what you're looking to buy is the most important thing. I've seen companies where they haven't really thought of, one, about their process, or two, what their stakeholders are looking for.
Yeah.
And then you implement a tool and, you know, it just is there and it just doesn't work. It's not really functioning the way you want. And then once you're in it, right, and you're in your day-to-day, it's hard to go back and try and refine that, right? Because your your sales team's moving fast, your attorneys are moving fast, and it's not a priority, right? You're focused on closing business, and then like refining the tool it's not a priority. So knowing what you're looking for and knowing what your stakeholders are looking for is really key to making it a success. Because if you can give them what they want, there's obviously a lot easier buy-in.
Yep. And when you get them on your side and you show them what's possible, hopefully it's realistic, by the way. Like, I should also call that out, because I've seen plenty of situations where the expectations from the users were set incorrectly, and that gets all into all kinds of trouble. But I'll encapsulate what you're saying into this 2-word phrase, which is use cases. Like, you got to be really clear about the use cases for why you need a CLM tool. And it can be very simple, by the way. Many organizations will benefit greatly from just having their contracts in one place. And I know it sounds almost like, what, really? But yes, just having a central repository to store your existing agreements, however they get signed, fine, and having some kind of reporting capability, that is a huge win for many organizations. Navin, any other kind of universal use cases that you would advocate for as people are thinking about either buying a CLM or switching out a CLM?
I mean, I think a huge use case, and this is something that comes up all the time, it's volume. Where is the team spending their time? How are they spending their time? Not just with turnaround time, but just volumes of contracts that they're dealing with, how much time they're spending. So I think with a CLM system, you can track a variety of metrics around how long your pre-signature process is really taking you, what information are we collecting, what information should we be collecting as well as part of this, so that we can be more efficient and iterate over time as well. And I think the other piece of it really is, how can I make myself as an entity, as an organization, easier to do business with, whether that's my customers or my suppliers and vendors as well, and using that system to streamline and improve. So I think, to summarize on that piece, it's that there's a lot of data that you should not overwhelm yourself, right? But there's a lot of data that you can collect with a CLM system around metrics and usage of the system, not just who's using it, but I think, Susan, you touched on it earlier as well. Who is submitting requests? Which person is submitting a lot of exception requests and urgent requests? And we can adjust that to, train a whole department or give individuals the training and coaching that they might need. And all of it would be a data-driven decision. As far as horror stories, should I lay one out, Akshay, because it ties into this actually.
Pitfall number 1, let's hear it.
Well, so it's exactly this, not knowing specifically what problem you're trying to solve and then just implementing a system. I worked with a legal team that was on the fence about implementing their CLM system for all of their vendor contracts. They had steamrolled the implementation with their customer contracts, and the sales team was really upset. They were not happy. They did not enjoy it. And so they were pushing hard to switch CLM systems. But again, it goes back to, it was implemented without thought. They just had a list of questions that they wanted to get information from Salesforce on, push it into the system, and then route it to legal. And so part of what needed to happen there was to redesign the entire series of workflows. The CLM was not SpotDraft, just to make it clear, but it was really a great use case of, they, with the best of intentions, they just had this vague idea of, we need to speed up our customer contracts process. And they wound up slowing it down instead by implementing the system without thinking through how they were going to design it, what information they wanted to collect, and how they wanted to collect it. I'm talking about intake forms here. Something as simple as, here's 10 questions you need to fill out, when this could have been one question connected to Salesforce, like 5 different data points in Salesforce, answering it automatically for the salesperson versus having them rekey it in. So I know, Will, I just figured I'd throw in my little horror story there. It had a happy ending in the sense that I just went in and I rebuilt all those workflows that they hated, and they wound up sticking with the CLM system that they had, because the issue wasn't the system. It was that they did not plan it effectively in their rush to attain all these glorious efficiencies that they expected to get on day one.
Yeah, no, I totally hear that. All right. So I'm now in a position where I have a good handle on my internal processes. I am fairly clear on existing or desired functionality for my CLM tool of choice. I have a good internal stakeholder group that is aligned on our goals for the program, and I will call it a program, as well as how the tool will then help enable that program. All right, so I've got all those things together. And I go out to the marketplace, and it's like, whoa, like where do I start? Who do I talk to? What should I consider? Do I need to do 10 POCs, 20 POCs? Do I need to do an RFI? Do I need to do it? Susan, where should I start when I actually go out into the market and I get a little bit overwhelmed with what's out there?
That's a good question. So I did go out and talk to everybody. That's where I started, right? I took all the feedback that I got from my legal team, that I got from my sales team, I got from my sales ops team, my finance team, right? Took all that out to the market, and I sat through every demo, right? And I knew what I was looking for because of that feedback, right? I knew what worked and I knew what didn't. And I was obviously in a position where I'd already used a CLM, and I've used multiple CLMs like throughout my career. So, I did have kind of, information, right? And I did have something to inform my decision, which if you haven't had experience with a CLM, I could see where this would be a very overwhelming task, right? So I was able to obviously drill down on very specific things when I was sitting in demos, because I knew exactly what I was looking for, and I knew how I wanted it to work, right? we've given our process a lot of thought, and it's been very carefully thought out. And so I knew that there were certain non-negotiables that a CLM had to offer me. And then I knew, like, I prioritized, right? Here are my non-negotiables. Here are my nice to haves. Here are kind of my pie in the sky.
Yep.
Right. So that's how I approached it. So I like I said, I looked at all of the major players out there. I sat through demos. Because I knew what my team was looking for. When I saw SpotDraft, I knew that it was like, I was ready to take this one back to the team. And I was like, here's what it touched on. Here's what it can do. And here's how I think it's going to actually improve our process and make our business users' lives easier. And it's going to make our attorneys' lives easier. So having, getting the stakeholder buy-in and having a really solid list of what you're looking for is going to help you spot things pretty quickly in demos. And it's going to also, help you drill down with the salespeople as well.
Yeah. Navin, anything you'd add to that as someone who has bought, sold, implemented, used, torn out, ripped out, put back together, put back in the CLM?
Oh my goodness.
Anything you'd add to that?
Do you have another 30 minutes? No, I think, obviously there are a ton of great solutions out in the marketplace. I think as far as figuring out what systems you should evaluate, having that clear list of criteria is important. What I would add is something a lot of people don't think about is the user experience. And so that is something you need to be very careful about, because it's extremely subjective. But what happens is people tend to get over focused on features. I need these 10 features. And that's important. If you need to integrate with Salesforce and be able to do a specific set of, data transfers and things like that, that should be something you should consider. But don't forget the user experience, because that leads directly into adoption, the success of your rollout. There's no point in having a feature that is technically fantastic, but your users do not know how to use it. And every new employee needs copious amounts of training in how to access it. And the good thing is CLMs have come a long way from the olden days when I had to use like ancient Aptus as an example. So but keep that in mind. Don't get over focused on just the features. Think about how your users are actually going to use them in practice as well. And obviously, if you have trouble figuring out the market and which systems to start evaluating, call me. No, I kid. But I think you definitely don't need to evaluate 15, 10 different systems. I would cap it at 5. And if you don't know, ask your peers or ask our panelists here, over LinkedIn, what we suggest you look at. I mean, we all know what Akshay's answer is going to be, but
So I will be very honest. There are times when I tell prospects, hey, we're actually not going to be right for you. And I think you raised two really important points. You have to know what's going to be right for you, or at least have a good level of understanding of what could be right for you, because that then allows you to evaluate what's in front of you. It helps you funnel down the choices in certain kinds of tooling, and also helps you think through, hey, and there are plenty of quote unquote CLM tools out there who play in a sliver of the contracting world, right? They'll focus on just, maybe just workflow, or they're focused just on AI extraction, or they'll focus just on a repository.
yeah.
Versus, no, I actually need a full end-to-end system, and here's why I need that. You may not need that, right? So I think that's knowing what's right for you is really important. It's like buying a car. I use this car analogy with my team at SpotDraft all the time. Right? There are lots of cars out there. Cars get you from one place to another. Why are there so many cars out there? Because different kinds of cars offer different kinds of things, and there are different kinds of use cases for individuals and families and so forth. And a CLM is it's not a simple piece of technology. It's a very complex configurable tool. And that's, I think that sometimes gets us into trouble because the expectation is that it should just be a set it and forget it kind of tool. It's not that. So there's that aspect of it. The other aspect, which you raised, Navin, is really, really important, is the UI UX, that experience. Apple is probably one of the best companies on the planet at this. And I know that because I remember when my older son, who was 1 year old, found my cousin's iPad and was navigating it without any problem, like just playing around with it. That to me is a humanly intuitive user interface and user experience. That's what that's what CLM tools and most technology should be after anyway. And it's so important to make sure that something that you are likely going to be looking at as your homepage for the day, or for the most part of the day, has that appeal to you. And I think different UIs and UXs can have a very different reaction depending on who's in front of it. So I think that's a really important call out. Okay, so I've gone out there, I've looked at the market, I have a pretty good understanding of what I want to do. I'm pretty clear on that. I've narrowed it down to a few different CLM tool providers that I want to look at for specific reasons. What does my evaluation criteria look like? Susan, how do I evaluate these tools? What's my next step?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I would say, how well does your process, I know we talked about process translating into technology, but how does it refine, like, how is it going to make your process easier, right? If you're doing something manual, how is this going to automate what you're doing, right? Attorney time is really expensive. How are we going to make this faster? How are we going to reduce the amount of administrative work that our attorneys are doing, right? If there's a lot of clicking and a lot of thising and downloading and uploading and all this stuff, it might be a 2 seconds here, 3 seconds there, but by the end of the month, end of the year, you're talking a lot of time, especially if you're in this platform all day, every day, negotiating contracts. For us, it was, going back to what was just said about user experience. How is our sales team going to be interacting with this? Is this going to make their lives easier, right? That's the biggest battle that you're going to fight, right? Yep. Is selling this to your sales team. How is this going to make their life easier? Are they going to be able to just stay in Salesforce and never have to leave, right? Is the integration done so well that they're in a, you know, they're in the platform that they're completely comfortable with, and they don't even realize that they're in something else, right? Like how much data can I link back to my to Salesforce or HubSpot or whatever platform you're using, so that it's automatically pulled in and they have to answer 3 questions. You know, how can I make our life, you know, the legal side easier by customizing contracts, by having drop downs and being able to modify language based on answers and create these sort of customized agreements that are going out. So that was a lot of our what was really important for us when we were looking at this, because this is time, you know, this is things that might be negotiated that we could build it right into our CLM that we don't have to do anymore, right? It's just a customized agreement that goes out. And then on the attorney side, you know, we were looking for, like, again, something that was making their life easier. Like, are they going to be able to redline directly in the platform? Are they going to, is this going to eliminate this download upload problem that you might have? How easy is it for them to converse with sales, like, directly through the platform? Those are all things that were very, very important for us. Yeah, and it's you know, it's important to think about how you interact with your with the business users, because that's how, you know, you're going to be moving, if you haven't implemented, you're moving everything into this one spot where at the end of the day, you're going to want to keep all of this data in this platform because it's valuable. Like, you can pull it out, you can pull data, you can see what you're doing, how you're spending your time, how long certain workflows take, and it's just going to help you continue. That data is going to inform how you continue to refine your process. So those were things that we thought about a lot when we were.
Anything you'd add to that from an evaluation perspective, especially now that you're in the business of helping customers evaluate CLM tooling?
No, I think I'll start with, I'm going to butcher your car analogy, right? Because I think, you know, when you're evaluating a system, it is like evaluating a car. But the most important thing is that you have to assess the process you have today. I mean, Susan already touched on this a little bit as well, but the process you have today, if you're starting from scratch, is a manual process that evolved by happenstance, by different people. It's a bit of a Frankenstein monster. A lot of the implementations and a lot of system selections, that's the first thing I always want to evaluate with my clients. How do you do it today? And how can we make that system friendly? So never evaluate systems and make selections based on your process today. With caveats, some people have this amazing process that's already super streamlined. It is typically not the case. So you need to clean house first. You know, look at your templates, look at your review cadence as well. What are you really going to review? Do you have playbooks? What information do you need to collect? All of that has to go into kind of clean up, essentially, to simplify it, to standardize it, and then you build your CLM criteria around that. The other piece is, I think, getting people to work in a new system is always going to be a huge stumbling block. So any way that you can keep people in the systems that they're already in, this, I'm basically making an integration argument here. Salespeople should never have to leave Salesforce and should never have to rekey what they've already entered in Salesforce. So I think a proper integration there is really important. So you're selecting that as well. But to go back to the car analogy, what I was getting at was really just, you can't switch from a horse and carriage to a Ferrari and then tie the horse to the back of the Ferrari and wonder why it's going so slowly. Poor horse. I mean, no animals were harmed in this webinar. But the point is that you need to evolve along so that you can actually use that system effectively. And so that's a major piece in building out and selecting a system as well. You need to understand your processes. You need to also track information. That was something that I think I saw someone in chat mention about ROI as well. And that's something people think about after they've implemented it. But what were you doing before? Make sure that you are tracking as much as you can, even if you have to do it manually for a little while. Understand what your status is now, how long things are taking, what the volumes are. Again, it's some manual work that people will complain about, but if you can just do that for a month to 3 months, that provides valuable data that then you can then compare after you've implemented the system to see if you're actually getting ROI as well.
Yeah, I think too, I love the tying the horse to the back of the Ferrari analogy. I love that. I think two pieces that I'll add to that that are more tactical in nature, and this is something that we're starting to actually ask for in our conversations during the sales cycle, is literally a list of requirements, a list of requirements. And it's one of those conversations, both through the sales process, but also through implementation, and then probably through adoption and growth over time, is you've got to keep coming back to that list. Because a contracting process or ecosystem within an organization is never static. It has to grow, it has to evolve, it has to iterate. And so the tool has to be able to do that. It's not going to do that magically, because it probably requires some coding and some level of engineering and some level of configuration in order to be able to adapt and grow with the customer. So I think that list, that just a really good list on a Google Sheet to be able to have that back and forth with the vendor and the customer is a really, really important one. And then I think making sure that if you're evaluating 2, 3, 4 systems, whatever that number might be, that you're consistent across that evaluation. So, if you're looking at how one particular tool gets to signature well, use the same templates in the same contract. If you want to evaluate how a particular repository extracts metadata from post-executed agreements, make sure you use the same set of agreements for all of those kinds of things. So it's like a scientific experiment to some extent, where you have some level of control across certain variables, and then the dependent variable is the tool in how it interacts with those. Sorry, the independent variable is the one that I'm going to completely screw this up because I forgot my elementary school science. But you're fixing one variable to make sure that you're evaluating that particular tool appropriately.
And Akshay,
Yeah.
when coming back to that list you mentioned as well, I think the other piece of it is grading your criteria and requirement. What are your must-haves versus nice-to-haves? Think about integrating with the procurement system. Yes, it might be nice to have, but if all that's saving you is maybe someone copying and pasting documentation over once a month or once a quarter, that might not be essential. And if you find a system that hits everything else, you can push that to the side and just have someone copy paste essentially as well, versus just kind of getting bogged down by checking every single box in your list as well.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on to the fun, or maybe not so fun part of this, which is around cost. Okay. Let's say that from my 5 overall that I wanted to take a look at, I'm down to maybe 2, like maybe 3, hopefully just 2. And I've asked them for a financial proposal. Susan, like through what lens should I evaluate some of the numbers that are in those proposals? Any advice that you could give the audience around that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's really important is recognizing where else the business is plugging into this, right? Like, I think most people think of CLMs and you think of sales and you think of legal, right? There's procurement, right? Some teams use this specifically just for that. So that's around, what is that going to cost, right? Certain things, certain implementations are an additional fee, right? Like, what are you getting with your base? What is actually included in the like base price that you get, and what are all of those? Oh, I really loved that feature, in the demo. How much, is that included? Oh no, and how much is that going to cost me, right? Because before you know it, like, you want you're like at the Mercedes, right? Going back to this car analogy, right? Like, you might have the Ferrari, the Mercedes price because you want certain features, or you think certain features are going to help you refine your process, or you need them because it's part of your process, right? If you're already using a CLM. So understanding what the initial quote that's put out in front of you might not always capture exactly what you think you're getting. So ask the questions.
Yep.
make sure that it's crystal clear, because you don't want to get into a situation where you've implemented, you purchased a product, you've implemented it, you're in the implementation process, and then you're like, wait, I wanted this thing, right? I needed to add an e-signature tool, or I needed some sort of other advanced capabilities. And then it's like, oh, that's an additional feature, right? That's an additional cost. And then before you know it, like, you think you've saved money, or you think you've gotten a great, or, it's a great value. And then before you know it, you've, just blown through your budget.
You raised a really important word, which I just want to drill down on, which is value.
Mhm.
Right, which is very different from cost. For whatever reason, in law school, I went to law school, I was a lawyer, so I can say this without denigrating lawyers too much. We literally do not understand the concept of value. That's not something that lawyers think about. So Navin, like, any advice that you would offer the audience on how to consider, evaluate, or demonstrate value of a tool? I know this is getting kind of post implementation, and I know we're getting a little ahead in the chronology of this whole thing a little bit, but I think it's a really important piece to call out right now, because I think this should be involved in your use case collection. It's like, hey, what does success look like?
Yeah.
How are we going to know this is valuable? What are some tactics you could offer up the audience on that one?
So a couple of things. I mean, to take it back to purpose and what problems you're trying to solve. If you've collected, you need to collect information around your use cases. How are we doing it today? And what the potential for change is. So a great example might be, hey, if we're going to automate away our NDAs and basically through this system, only have 20% of our NDAs reviewed by legal, with the rest of them just being standardized, automated, sent straight out for signatures. That is a quantifiable metric that you can then tie to the cost that you are paying, and you can demonstrate value. So unfortunately, I'm not going to give you guys the easy way to do it, because there really isn't an easy one. There's some work involved. I think collecting data and metrics around volumes, times, all that stuff, information about the types of contracts that you are signing, so that you can juxtapose that against data to show value. Now, in the initial sales cycle, everyone gets wowed by demos, right? This looks cool, that looks cool, which is the purpose of a demo as well. And unfortunately, in the CLM space, it's not very easy to compare prices, because you're not comparing apples to apples. You need to make sure that you understand how this pricing is being positioned to you. Is it based on number of user licenses? Is it based on number of documents that you're storing in the system, or number of workflows that you're building to automate your contracts? There's a wide variety of pricing structures that vendors use that can result in some confusion. And so you need to be really careful. You need to make sure you understand how the vendor is pricing, because that ties into how you value that system. You could see $100,000 price tag, and without realizing it, in year two, that quadruples in price, because you've loaded up a ton of documents into your system that you never really discussed on day one or in the initial scoping phase as well. And then you get caught with, hey, it was valuable in year one. We had fantastic ROI. And in year three, this is a disaster. We need to change systems to something cheaper. So I think, obviously price and value kind of go hand in hand. You understanding where the inefficiencies are and having data to back it up, that's one. The second piece is understanding the vendor's pricing. Of course, you should make them standard pricing evaluation rules apply here. Get your vendor to break down their cost, not just give you one big number. The other piece that you really, really need to be aware of is the cost of professional services. Sometimes that's baked in, but it's capped in certain ways. And so everyone's talking about AI. Well, if you want 100% accuracy with an AI tool, that may require some professional services for contracts that perhaps are poorly imaged, have a lot of graphics in them, things like that. And so that can impact the value you get from the system as well, because you're thinking, well, it's going to be super easy. I'll upload all of my contracts, and now the system can create alerts. I can create reports. Only 50% of your contracts are poor illegible scans that you kind of put in through a scanner 8 years ago, and they can't be analyzed effectively. So I realized that was a bit of word salad, but to summarize, understand your problems and what you're really putting into that system. That can help drive you in assessing how valuable that system is and help you identify what features in that system are actually important and going to lead to maybe less time reviewing things, fewer people having to spend time digging through contracts, and so on and so forth.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes left, which I think is just the right amount of time to talk through a little bit around implementation. And in this conversation, I think we'll also touch upon some of the questions that are both in the chat and in the Q&A, which is around the transfer of data. And it doesn't matter whether you're selecting and implementing a CLM for the first time or switching one out, unless you're starting with 0 contracts, which is probably not the case, because then you probably didn't need a CLM tool in the first place. There's going to be some level of data and files. And I want to be very clear on the distinction between the two. There are actual files. Maybe it's PDF, maybe it's some other format, which is like your contract itself. It's the pages of the contract. And then there's the data that's associated with that document. And I call that metadata. We'll stick with that nomenclature, which are, what are the basic terms of this agreement, right? So party, counterparty, dates, termination dates, things of that nature. That is data that needs to go either from several places to one place or in some fashion flow to different systems. And so several people have asked about the pain in kind of migrating that data. Migrating files is super easy now. We can literally just like copy paste. Like it's really that easy. You can create SFTP sites. There's lots of easy ways to do that. The hard part and the time consuming part and the complicated part and the part that creates error is the data migration. Right? So Susan, I've now selected my champion. I'm ready to implement. What are some key things that I want to set right up front with my vendor when we think about implementation?
Yeah. So it's, in terms of data migration, I would say that's probably equally as difficult as the implementation with the users. It's a not easy process, no matter how you try to do it, right? So I would think long and hard about if you're coming from a place where you're switching, what worked? Were you able to capture, like you were saying, metadata, right? That's probably one of the most important pieces around the switch, is making sure that you're not losing any data or insights into your contracts. So what are your absolute must-haves? And then what do you need, right? Like that's an opportunity, again, to continue refining, right? You've had something, you're switching, what worked, what didn't, what do we want to capture, right? So we took this as an opportunity, is like, what else is it just outside of legal? Like, are there other areas of the business that might need to be capturing data because they're tracking their own things, right? So how do we build that in? And so that's, again, just having those conversations with the stakeholders and other areas of the business. So how can we make this tool not only valuable to legal, but valuable to the rest of the business?
Yep.
And deciding like what's important to track and what isn't, right? Not every agreement might need tracking. Like you might not need to track what's in your NDAs, right? You might just really need to track what's in your customer agreements or partner agreements or, certain things in vendor agreements. So it's, you can make it easier. You can, if it's, you're only tracking in one specific area. But yeah, I would say, like you said, I'm going back to what you said, making the migration itself is not that complicated. It's easy to bulk upload, run the AI over your contracts and pull out that metadata. And then you're usually good to go.
Navin, anything that you would add from your vast implementation experience?
In many cases, skipping kind of a comprehensive migration is actually an option for a lot of folks implementing a CLM system. See, the thing about migrating your current body of contracts, and don't get me wrong, there's value in having all of your contract files in one place. That is important for any business, and so you should do that. But that can stop there, because a lot of the time when you talk about data, so again, to differentiate, just like you did, Akshay, files versus data, if you have contract data that you want to migrate into a system, where is that data coming from? Is it actually reliable data? Because in my experience, bad
Yeah.
data is so much worse than
Yeah.
no data. So if you have exactly, if you have a bunch of data that's been manually keyed in and things like that, really have a discussion about how valuable that data really is. Because even though it exists, the reality might be people are pulling up contracts manually and looking at them anyway from SharePoint and not relying on the 5 different Excel spreadsheets that you have today. And so in that case, loading up just the files into a CLM system, letting their AI run on it and pull data could be the end of it as well. The other piece of it is just to build on something Susan said, identify what contracts are really important to you, because you can just zoom into a subset of your contracts and then have those manually reviewed as well. If AI is not sufficient for you, use an outsourced company or run a project to just go, these are 1,000 contracts that are critical to us. We need to make sure that these are thoroughly reviewed and we extract data from it, like correct dates. Perhaps we use to handwrite counterparty names in the contracts, things like that. So don't overkill is not a good idea with migration, because it usually stalls. And you know what? Post implementation, it is incredibly rare for people to come back to me and say, oh, it was really difficult to find a contract in my CLM system.
Yeah.
It's always focused on the pre-signature aspect of
Yeah.
contracting, not searching. Because once you load the contracts into a CLM system, it is infinitely better than trying to find it in SharePoint or Google Drive or Dropbox or Box, whatever you're using now, or worse yet, in random people's desktops. So don't let yourself get held back by this self-imposed enormity of the migration. It's not as serious as you think it is what I would say.
A fantastic point. I'll touch on a couple of the questions real quick. I think from an integrations perspective, that's hopefully something that you've scoped out early enough. What can this tool integrate with? The reality of technology and software is that 2 pieces of technology can be made to fit together. You can do that. How complicated that might be and the value that you get out of it, expectations versus reality, is something that you have to figure out with respect to the tool that you want to buy and the tool that you already have. Right? So somebody asked about a lending platform or proprietary lending platform. My guess is they want some of the data in the contracts that they have to flow into that lending platform for business purposes. If there are public APIs on both sides, very straightforward, data can flow back and forth. If there are public APIs on both sides, it becomes more complicated, it takes longer. But the reality is you can fit those 2 pieces of software together. It's something you just scope out early with whoever it is that you might be considering. The last question on this, I think, Susan, you had touched on this earlier. So anything else you want to add, which is there are always going to be naysayers and people who are like, I don't want to use this. I'm not using this thing. It sucks.
Yeah.
What advice would you offer the champions of these tools with people like that?
I would say once you've selected a tool, it's pretty easy to say this is going to here. Sometimes it's the leader, there's stakeholders. You've kind of talked to people like throughout the organization and been like, I understand you don't want to switch. Switching is hard, it's costly, it's nobody wants to do it. But again, demonstrating the value that a new tool is going to bring to the organization over an existing tool, or just in general, right? What are the problems that it's going to solve? How is it maybe going to make their team's life easier? Right? You can go into you kind of go into a sales pitch, right? It's all a sales pitch to them and how to get them on board. And I've had to do this with different areas of the business when we've implemented, and when we did decide to switch, how demonstrating to certain leaders that their team actually would prefer to switch was a big help in getting people on board. And then, again, just demonstrating the value, whether it's cost or whether it's specific features, or, that it's going to make everybody's, how it's going to impact their ability to do business. It is always helpful.
I attended a conference a couple of years ago where one of the topics was change management. And the speaker talked about the naysayers in any kind of change management. And he had some really good advice. He's like, we often, as legal ops or champions of change, over-index on the naysayers. Okay? And if you have a strong enough group of stakeholders who are the proponents of what you want to do, those naysayers often find themselves on an island once the thing is up and running. You know what? Leave them there. Honestly, leave them there. It's not worth your fight. You have to be very careful around the kind of sway that they have internally. So you want to be cognizant of that. But at the end of the day, if enough people are going to be doing this and it's going to be adopted, so be it. It's probably not worth the effort. That would be my advice on that particular aspect of it as well.
It's great advice.
Yeah, no, you're right, Akshay. I mean, there's always going to be a few grumpy folks that never want to try anything new or change. But at the same time, there's an element of silliness here, right? It is a problem when it's a member of leadership or
Sure.
heads of
Yeah.
departments and organizations that don't want to adapt, and then their teams kind of follow suit as well. And so the two things I will say on this are really that, when it comes to adoption and naysayers, it can help to ignore them. Don't over adjust to that, because think about using your personal email to do work stuff. People just follow those rules. Well, we use Microsoft Outlook. You can't use your personal Gmail account for company business. And so it's that piece, it has to be enforced, right? You have to follow our contract policy. You have to use our review system, and there can be no compromises about it. When it's leadership that is not bought in, that can be a lot more challenging. But I think that's where you focus in on how it's going to help them. So it's not about what features there are or what's cool. And what I found is that take a sales leader, for example, they have a few critical issues, deals that went wrong, that they're upset about. We didn't close this because the contract took too long, for example. If you can zoom into specific incidents that they care about and show them how a system would have actually helped bypass this or gotten this in front of a GC faster, that will get their buy-in. So you really have to zoom into your
Make it relevant to
specific
them.
stakeholders' need, exactly, and use a real life example. Don't be amorphous and hypothetical. It really helps if you have a real life issue that you can solve for them.
All right. Well, look, we're on time, at time. Thanks very much to both of you for your insights and for the conversation. And Mike, I will turn it back over to you.
Yeah, thank you all for joining. I want to give an opportunity, Dory, if you could put up the quick question to see who wants to hear more from SpotDraft about their solutions, about how they can start a CLM and maybe just improve current processes. I'm sure they'd be happy to have a conversation with you. For any of you who joined late, just know that you'll be able to get a recording of this conversation, and we'll make sure to have contact information for all of our guests. Thank you all again, and we'll see you all on the next webinar here at Law Insider. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. Take care.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.